Hey everyone, thanks for joining. My name is Jeff Martinez. I'm a product manager on Azure App Service. And today we're going to be talking about securing your intelligent web apps with .NET 9 on App Service. So for the agenda, we have a couple of announcements first to go over for .NET 9 support. And then we'll also cover a recent announcement for Azure SQL native vector support. And then we'll be getting into a security demo where we'll be going over securing your secrets with Azure Key Vault and setting up managed identity for your Azure resources, so for both OpenAI and Azure SQL. So for .NET 9 support on App Service, once again, we do have day zero support for .NET 9 as we've had with previous versions. You can build and deploy your .NET 9 apps for both Windows and Linux. You will notice that in the portal, if you look at the runtime version for .NET 9, it'll have this early access tag next to it, which is going to replace the preview tag if you've already been using it. Now, when you're creating a .NET 9 app on Windows, we use what's called an early access feature, and that downloads and runs the GA bits when you create the app. So the trade-off being for supporting it on day zero is that it's going to have this initial cold start. And also a caveat on Windows this year is that if you're building your apps in App Service using MS Build or using that SCM do build method, that's not going to be supported until December. We recommend deploying with GitHub Actions, Visual Studio Code, or DevOps, since that build is happening outside of App Service. Now, this is not the case for Linux. You can create the app with no delays. And after a few weeks, once the GA bits are all rolled out on the rest of the platform, that early access tag will be removed. And you don't have to do anything or make any changes, as your apps will already be running on those GA bits. Okay. So our second announcement is not necessarily an app service announcement, but more of an Azure SQL announcement, although they do couple well together. We know a lot of you guys out there use Azure SQL with your web apps. But Azure SQL now has native vector support in public preview. So if you're creating those intelligent apps and you want to ground your data, ground your context in your own data, you can do a vector search, and you can use this new vector data type. So you can create and store vectors in the database directly. And we'll see an example of this in a hybrid search that's being used later in the demo. Okay. And for the demo, when it comes to securing your intelligent apps with .NET 9, you want to make sure that you're properly securing your secrets and your resources. So with App Service, we can use Azure Key Vault references to handle our secrets. And since we're using those Azure resources, we can leverage using managed identity to handle the identity through the platform. So you don't need to use something like an API key and handle that directly in your code. So for our demo, we're just going to go ahead and set up Key Vault references and managed identity for our Azure resources. Okay, so first we'll do an overview of the sample app that we have. So we know what we're working with. Here we have a very simple .NET 9 chat application, which is hosted on App Service, and it's using an Azure OpenAI chat completion service. And our data is grounded from our Azure SQL database. So I can actually pull that up in Azure Data Studio, and it contains hundreds of food reviews. So here you can see just a sample of the data that has food review summaries and a full text of the food review. And it also has this vector binary column. Now, that column is part of that new Azure SQL vector support. And this column uses a specific vector data type that we've pre-created using SQL functions. And it will be used in our results when we do the hybrid query search with our chatbot. Okay, let's go ahead and ask it a question. We can ask it, what orange juice has the highest review? And as we wait for that to answer, we can actually go to our logs in our deployed web app, and we can see the output from our hybrid search, and it gives us a number of values that it's going to build that answer from. So here we can see it outputs the score value, it outputs text and the summary of the reviews. And then at the very bottom, it has this distance output as well. And that distance is the cosine distance value between the embedded value of your message that you're sending and the value of each search result entry. So if we actually go back to our chatbot, and it gives us an answer which responds with the highest reviewed drink that it saw, and that was coming from what we see in the logs. So let's take a deeper look at the search query behind the chat app. So if we go into the code, and we can see this hybrid search query, and we see that it starts off by taking our user message as a parameter, and it brings it into a stored procedure, which makes a call to the Azure OpenAI endpoint and gives us our embeddings back. And then those embeddings go into this E variable that we're then going to use to be calculated against that vector binary that we saw in the database earlier. So we're using this SQL function called vector distance, which calculates the cosine value and adds it as that distance that we saw in the logs earlier. And from there, we have a number of other filters using SQL commands. You can see that we have a threshold. We only want scores returned that are of 4 or greater. And we're ordering by the distance of the cosine number, so we can sort of get that top value and the best output that's closest to what we're looking for. Okay, so now we know how our intelligent chat application works. We want to make sure that it's secure. So when we're working with Azure OpenAI, there are a number of values that we need to pass in that we don't want exposed to the outside world. So in this current implementation, we have our app settings, which is simply referencing the endpoint values, which are added in our app settings.json file. And then we have it coming in through iConfiguration and passed into our Azure OpenAI service. Now, app service does encrypt app settings at rest, so you can deploy this as is. But if you want more control of your settings and you can access them, we want to take advantage of storing our secrets in something like Azure Key Vault. And if you're not familiar with Azure Key Vault, it's a service that provides a centralized secrets management. And it's a great service for not only abstracting your secrets from the code, but it gives you control over access policies and monitoring activity as well. So with app service, we would do this specifically by using a Key Vault reference. So let's go ahead and create a Key Vault reference. Now, the first thing we need to do when creating that is go to our web app. And we want to make sure that our app is set up with system-assigned identity. And you can see here under the identity blade, under settings, we have system assigned turned on. And what this is going to do is register your application with Microsoft Entra ID. So we can then configure access to Key Vault. If you wanted to here, you can also use user assigned for more granular control on who and what can access it. But for our case, we're just going to use system assigned. So next, we will need to go to our Key Vault resource, and we want to go to the access control blade once it loads, and then we want to go to this card where it says grant access to this resource. You're going to want to add a role assignment. And right here, we're going to search for the function. It's going to be called Key Vault Secrets User. Okay, and you can see the description here, Key Vault Secrets user, and it allows us to read the secret contents, which is all we need. Then you'll hit next. And for the members, you're going to want to assign access to managed identity and select your member. Under managed identity, you'll search for app service. And you'll select the name of your application. So I have mine as .NET 9 chat app. And you'll click this as a member, and then you'll hit select. Now, I've already had this created, so I'm not going to go through that process. But once you create this, you should be good to go on the portal side. And then from here, you can set up your secrets. So in the same Key Vault resource, you're going to go to Objects and Secrets, and you're going to generate and import a secret. So here is where you would add a name, like, if we want to put the deployment name from our Azure OpenAI endpoint. Oh, there we go. Okay, it doesn't like the underscore. And then we'll have our secret value added. And you want to make sure that enabled is checked to yes before you hit create if you're going to use it immediately. Again, we have this one created, so we don't need to actually create it. Now, before you create your reference, you're going to need to click into the secret that you've created and click on the specific version, because we're going to grab the secret URI. So you're going to copy the secret identifier here, and we're going to take this back to our web app and go to our environment variables and add this. So we're going to click add. Okay. So here we're going to name our environment variable, and we can call it deployment name. And then when we add our secret, we're going to use a very specific syntax. We're going to have @microsoft.keyvault secret URI. And this is where we're going to add that URI that we took earlier from our Key Vault secret. And the syntax needs to be this way so app service knows that you're going to use a reference and it can figure out how to actually resolve it. And then you would also hit apply, but we're going to look at a previously created one. So you can see here I have deployment name and endpoint added to this web app. And we have the Key Vault secret source as well. So you can click here and see a few more details on the Key Vault reference. This is telling us that it's resolved and it's good to go. However, if something was broken or you forgot a step to maybe grant the resource access or set up system assigned identity, it would tell you here. Okay, so that's all we need to do on the portal side. So in the application, all you need to do is use iConfiguration and bring in the name values of your environment variables. So I've done that here. And in our case, we can replace the app settings that's pointing to the app setting in my JSON file. So from here, we've set up Key Vault references, and we've done this for the deployment name and the endpoint. But we still have the API key and model ID that's pointing to the app settings in our code. If you wanted to, you could add both the API key and the model ID as Key Vault references as well. Like, let's say you're not using an Azure resource, you're just using OpenAI. You could do that and you would be completely fine. But because we are using an Azure resource, we can leverage using managed identity to secure that connection. So, and again, managed identity allows you to access resources that are other protected Azure resources without needing to manage secrets. So what we'll be able to do is actually get rid of needing the API key and model ID. Okay, so let's go ahead and source. And the first thing we need to check in the code is that this library is brought in, the Azure.identity package, because that will let you actually use the Azure credential. And then, as I said earlier, we will now no longer be needing the API key and model ID, so we can comment that out. And we can use this version of the service where we have the deployment name and the endpoint name, and now we're just using the credentials, and we're using this default Azure credential. Quick note on that, this is good for development to use the default Azure credential to test things out. But if you're going to do this in production, you might want to use something a little bit different, right? Okay, so now we need to make sure that our web app is set up in the portal to use managed identity on Azure OpenAI. And we're going to go first back to our chat application and just double check that system identity is turned on. Because if you're doing this for the first time, we just did this with Key Vault, but if you're doing this for the first time, this would need to be turned on. And then we can go over to our OpenAI resource and do the steps that we previously did with Key Vault. So you go to your access control, grant access to this resource, add the role assignment. And now we're looking for something a little bit different, and it's going to be cognitive services OpenAI user. And you can see here that this role, it allows us to view files, models, and deployments, but we can't make any changes. So this is all we need to get our app to work. Okay, click next, and this would be the same as we did for Key Vault, managed identity. You select the member, select app service, and you'd search for your app. And you hit select. And once again, this one was already created, so we won't do it here, but that's all you need to do. So at this point, a resource with a combination of Key Vault and managed identity. Next, we just need to secure our SQL database using managed identity. So if we actually go back to our server resource, the process is a little bit different. So first thing we'll need to do is find the Microsoft Entra ID blade under settings. And you're going to want to set an admin. Now, setting an admin is just going to be your Microsoft Entra account. So I have mine, which I would select and select. Again, this one's already set, so we'll exit of that. And then you're going to want to make sure you check this box, which is going to disable any current SQL authentication you have. So if you're just using that connection string with the password, that will be disabled once you click this, and you can only authenticate using Microsoft Entra going forward. So we'll check that. And then from here, we can actually go to our database and look at our connection string. And like I mentioned, you might have been using this previous SQL authentication connection string, but that one no longer works because we've checked that box. So we'll actually be using this passwordless authentication. So you'll copy this and you'll put it wherever your connection string lives. In our case, I have added the connection string to our environment variables under connection strings. And I've added the SQL connection string here. So it has that value with the passwordless connection string. Okay. So from here, you can actually test your application as it is once you have that connection string connected. See, I have it here. However, going to deploy this to app service, it's not going to have all the permissions it needs yet to work. So we still need to grant access and build that connection between our app and the SQL database. So we're actually going to go back to our database, and we're going to go to the query editor. Log in with Entra authentication. Now that we have the query editor open, we're going to run a few commands that are going to grant us access. So this will first create a user and alter the roles, and then it's going to grant access for those for use of the stored procedure we used earlier, which includes that call to the OpenAI endpoint. And this is, SQL's way of going through those managed identity steps to grant access to the database. So, like everything else, this was ran before. However, we can run another query to sort of see some of the results, to confirm that everything is there. We'll see the results, and you can see our .NET 9 chat app assigned to data reader, data writer, and admin as well. So once these roles are confirmed and our app has access and it's granted to everything, it's ready to go, and you can deploy to app service. Okay, so to wrap up, we now have our secrets secured with key vault references and our resources secured with managed identity. That's the end of the demo. If you want more information on using SQL vector support, or if you want to try out .NET 9, you can visit our quick start. And if you want to keep up with the team, we have the app service blog link here. Or if you want to follow us on x.com, we have an app service account there.